Hi, I'm Francisco Rodriguez, and I'm going to talk about Wolfram Alpha in Spanish. That's going to be the next Wolfram Alpha localization release. Hi, I'm Francisco Rodriguez. I work for the Wolfram Research South America office, and today I will talk about Wolfram Alpha in Spanish. Or, as we will say in the future, Wolfram Alpha en Español. So this talk will be in English, don't worry. But I wanted to give it in Spanish, but I think most people here doesn't speak Spanish, so that's fine. So as summary, I will talk about this next project of Wolfram Alpha. We already released Wolfram Alpha Japanese, and the next project that we expect to release is Wolfram Alpha in Spanish. So I will talk about a bit about the project in general and some challenge we have and what's coming. This is a small outline of what we are going to follow today. So, well, I guess you all know what's Wolfram Alpha. It's a very unique system. We answer questions. Anything you want to know, we try to answer. It's been already in the market for a bit more than 10 years. You already know the address, and we want to do everything computable. So all the knowledge we know about everything to be computable and to be accessible with Wolfram Alpha. It has some unique features, like, for example, this natural language querying. You can ask in natural language. We have trillions of data points, millions of entities, of data curated, computed data. Some of the problems maybe here is that most of the sources we have are also for the US. That's something we also want to expand, of course. And something very interesting is that it has a dynamic presentation of the results. So it computes the results on the fly. So it tries to figure out what you are asking and tries to compute something about that. So it generates the result in that moment, usually. And that means that also we need to have a way to generate them. And the problem is that, not the problem, but one feature is that usually we assume an English-speaking way to generate the things, the sentences, the results, to show them. So that's something part of this challenge of localizing Wolfram Alpha. So what's the main motivation of doing this localization? Is that initially Wolfram Alpha only was released in English. But English is not the most spoken language in the world, but there are many other languages with more than 50 million speakers. So we have Chinese languages, we have Hindi, Spanish, Russian, Portuguese, Indonesian, etc. There are many languages. So initially we released that only in English. Then we went to Japanese. The next step probably is going to be Spanish and Korean, which is also in very good shape. And then we want to expand to French, to Chinese, to Russian. Probably then we would like to expand even more, but these are the ones that are currently in progress. So now the goal we have is to make this computational knowledge accessible not only to English speakers, but to everybody internationally. So we can say anyone in, I don't know, in Chile can take and understand the results we have. Anyone in France, anyone in Russia, etc. So that's the idea of localizing, to be able to reach everybody. Anyway, this project is built upon over the English version. So this means that in the localized versions, also any English query will work, because we are building on top of the English version. And of course, this localization effort is done by a lot of developers, translators, testers, curators. So we have a huge team behind all this project. And something important is that we have native speakers for every language. So that's something I think remarkable. It's not that we are simply doing a Google translation of everything, but we have people who actually was born in the language so that can understand not only the language but also the culture. Because it's not only a matter of saying, okay, 1 plus 1 is 1 más 1, but also maybe in some parts it's said in a different way, a different way to show, to display the things is important. So a bit about the status. We already released Wolfram Alpha Japanese. So this product was released last year. It's been in production for a while now, a bit more than a year. The next expected release, as I said, is Wolfram Alpha Spanish. But we can also show how much is ongoing the progress. So right now we are focusing only in the math content, and that's something important to set the scope of the project, is that we are translating the math content of Wolfram Alpha as first release milestone, because that's actually the most used feature in Alpha. So I think 90% of the queries are for math content. And in terms of how much we have progress translating the whole site, if we take out all the entities, because the entities are millions of entities, so we have not translated them yet, Japanese is around 40% of output correctly translated, displaying correctly. Spanish is almost in 50%, but in terms of input, it means in terms of what you can input, what you can ask about, Japanese is around 50% of all the grammar rules. That's what we call them, grammar rules. In Alpha has been translated to, adapted to Japanese. Of course, we don't need to translate everything, because to translate, for example, mathematical expressions, in general, you don't need to translate exactly all the symbols. The symbol plus is the same in all the languages, but sometimes we also need some extra symbols for other languages. So in that sense, I think we are doing a good progress in all the languages. Chinese also is in very good shape. So, of course, that takes out all the entities, which is a different project that we need to tackle also, to how to get the translation of all the millions of entities we have in Alpha in a proper way. Of course, some common, let's say, domains are translated, like, for example, I don't know, names of the countries. That's a small set that we already translated to all the languages. But anyway, we are clear that the first step is to translate all the math content. So, well, I was already talking about this challenge, which is all this data that we need to translate, all these tokens, all these grammar rules, names, etc. And the problem, not the problem, part of this challenge is to translate this in all the components that are needed in Alpha. So Wolfram Alpha is a large system, has a component to interpret the input, has a different component to display the input, the calculate scan we call it. Has a different component for storing the data, all these packlets internally we have. There is a different component, which is the website itself. So it has to be also translated, to be worked on. So we need to work in many, many places to have a complete product. And of course, how we compute dynamically the answers is something that we need to consider in each language by itself. So for example, about sentence building. So we need to build a sentence, and usually in English we put the words together, and usually it works fine. But in other languages we need to be more careful. You need to agree between the gender, for example, of the subject, the verb, the verbal phrase, etc. You need to agree between the adjectives and the nouns. You need to agree between different parts. Also, when you use a definite article or an indefinite article, may be different in different languages. So that's something to consider when building the sentences. Numbers also, when come with a unit, for example, or with a noun, may have a different way to display. For example, in Asian languages, you need this counter word. In Russian, you need to inflect the word depending on the number value. So if it's 5, it's a different value for meters than if it were 4. So for English, it's basically singular and plural. For other languages, maybe more complicated. All this logic has to be incorporated into alpha. And it's been already working that way, but so it's part of the challenge we encounter when we said, okay, let's translate all alpha. So it was not as easy as saying, okay, now instead of saying more, I will say más in Spanish. So that's maybe one word, but when you have to build a whole sentence, it doesn't work. So we need to refactor a lot of code. We need to implement a lot of new auxiliary functions to handle the inflections, handle how to build the sentences. We have added our own template system to actually have a better way to display the sentences. And that means refactoring a lot of code, and that's still on progress, of course. So we have focused on all the math stuff. We still need to expand to other domains, of course. But that's a work in progress. Other small challenge I'm talking, for example, the decimal separator. You know that the decimal separator is the point, usually in English, but in other languages, it may be the comma. Indeed, most European languages use the comma, only English in Europe, but also the rest of the world uses points, so it's half-half. In Spanish in particular, it's complicated because even when the comma was the traditional decimal separator, now countries like Mexico, which is together with bordering US, is using the point, actually. So it's a mix. So in Spanish in US and Spanish in Mexico, they usually use the point. In the rest of Latin America, it's like a mix. I have even seen newspapers articles in Peru where they mix the usage of the comma as decimal separator and as thousand separator. That's a mess. So they have something like 1.5% of 12,000 to say 12,000. So in one line, they mix the usage of the comma even. So that's a horrible mix we have still in Spanish that we have to also try to figure out from the user input what they mean. And that's hard to tell sometimes. We've been progressing on that a lot, but it's anyway something very challenging at the input heuristics. And also we have to adapt to different formats for displaying. For example, about the date and time. And the date and time, it's in particular interesting because it's not only a matter of the language, but also a matter of the location. So if I am speaking Spanish in US, it's more common to talk in, let's say, 12 hours format. Or if I'm in Spain, in 24 hours. If I am Peru, it's a mix between 24 hours and 12 format. In Colombia, 12 hours format, etc. So depending on the place, you have a different format of the time of the date. That also applies for English, and that's something we have already adapted to the spoken results. Still not there for the web results, but that's part of the same effort of having the right localization for everybody. Also about numbers, it's interesting that we needed to adapt how we split the numbers, because not in all the languages they split the numbers by blocks of 3 digits, and that's something that was interesting to find. I didn't know that, by the way, before starting all this project. The fact that in some Asian language they split by blocks of 4 digits. And also something that is sometimes confusing, in particular for translating English and Spanish, is that the word billion, which is very similar to billion, is actually in a different scale, because Spanish, French, all European languages still use the long scale instead of the short scale that now uses US English. That means that 1 billion is 2 to the 9, but in Spanish, un billón is actually 2 to the 12, even when the word is almost the same. And for French, it's even worse because the word is exactly the same spelling. So, for example, if we ask for the Spanish Spain population, while in English we will say about 46.4 million people, in Japanese we will use a different figure to see that number in a block of 4 digits. And in Spanish we will, in general, use the comma, aproximadamente 46,4 millones. Another challenge we had was about the words that were only composed of one letter. So that was a problem because it's confusing also with, for example, variables. In Spanish, the A, E, O, U, Y are also words with its own meaning. So what happens when we find them in math expressions? Are they the word, or are they the preposition, or the conjunction, or the word they mean? So we try to figure out, we have done a lot of work also trying to have a good heuristic on how to interpret them. We have been successful, not in all the cases, but almost, I think, in many cases where could be ambiguous. And that's very interesting. Then I will show some examples. For example, for this case, resolver x más y igual a 3 y x menos y igual a 8. So that y here in the middle is actually the and. So I want to solve 2 different equations, and that's working. So it interprets correctly. This is 2 equations that I want to solve. But if I want to ask for the solución a una ecuación, where this a is a preposition, in this case the a is not actually figuring out it's a preposition, and if I use a different preposition, it works. So we're still progressing on how to interpret all these equations and how to separate when a word is part of the equation and when it's part of the sentence. Yeah?
Are you going to generate assumptions, like assume A is a preposition, assume A is a variable, or are you just going to make your best guess and hope it's right?
The idea is that eventually we should have the assumptions, but have the best guess to be the first default. That's the proper idea. But sometimes it's actually hard to have the word of assumptions with this guessing of the prepositions, because the way alpha interprets the sentences. Yeah, that would be the ideal case, yes. Before going to the examples, something about the fact that the Spanish is spoken officially in 17 countries, is de facto in different levels in 6 different countries. In particular, I show here New Mexico, where there are some parts where it's the de facto language also. And also, Philippines and United States are members of the RAE, which is the official organization that tries to not impose, but to put all the rules about the Spanish. We can see a heat map of populations. Mexico, of course, is the largest country speaking Spanish, and US is actually the second country speaking Spanish, with more than 50 million, so I split them by state. So there are states with more speakers than even any Central America country. So it's interesting that you have also large population of Spanish speakers in countries like Australia or Japan, so with more than 100,000 speakers. So actually, releasing Wolfram Alpha in Spanish will let us reach millions of people. Of course, the main block of speakers is in America. America continent has most of the speakers, then Europe, and then the rest of the world. So, and now we can see some examples. So this is going to be the main entry point. So we already have here a working alpha web. And we should be able to ask anything, well, not anything, but we are in progress of working on it. And of course, we have translated the solutions, the step-by-step solutions, so that we can show all these steps and how to do them in Spanish. So we have a lot of domains already translated, of course. Most of math domains are already in place. We still need, let's say, a quality review, of course. This is one case of for example, that we needed to actually do something for having an agreement between the word and the ordinals, for example, in Spanish. So it wouldn't be the same if this word were a feminine word, because you would need to say tercera instead of tercero. So now in all the ordinal places, we have added what's the gender of the next word. And something else is that we needed to add that for each language, because the gender in each language may be different. So the gender of a word in Spanish is different than the gender of the same word in German, or in French, or in French probably it's going to be similar, but but in German or in other languages, yeah. So that's part of all this challenge we needed to figure out how to solve. Here is also an example where I had a mixing of commas and points, and it's figuring out both should be commas or decimal separators. We have not still translated the assumptions, by the way, sorry. Still on progress, but the idea is that you can also choose, oh, that comma was not for a decimal separator, but for a list separator. So that should be able to interpret that way. So this should be formatting, I guess, yes. Because I'm logged in with my user, it thinks I'm in Peru, so it's formatting with the time for the time zone in Peru. So for example, for what day is today, we can also interpret this in different ways. If I want to know the full date or only which day of the week it is, día de la semana. So all this is part of the, and of course calculus is one of the main points we have to solve. And we have also already done the effort of, well, we have, let's show this case of the solving two equations. So it figures out correctly that it is two equations that I want to solve. For now, we don't have any assumption, but maybe we will need that. Of course, that in the result, that looks nice because we have a different gray form to show the and, so you can actually see the difference. The solution works. This is the step-by-step solution, so that we can have all this nicely there. Of course, I want, before we finish, have 1 minute, I think. We have already translated all these, all the math examples, Still, we need to translate the head. So in the example pages, we can browse all the examples, how they are working. Let's take one, I don't know, valores propios, for example, eigenvalues. And in this case, for example, I think, yes, it did correctly. This 4,1 was interpreted correctly as a part of the matrix, because it didn't make sense to interpret that as a one decimal value in this case, because you already had a list of two values, a second part, so everything should be a matrix. So it interprets correctly that in this case the comma is a list separator, and well, it's working fine. The step by step, etc. So, well, I think I'm over the time. So if you have any other quick question, yes? Yes, we have already translated 4,500 units for Spanish, and it's been a long effort. And also in other languages, even more problematic. For example, in Russian, we needed to add more fields to all the plurals, which is actually the genitive case for Russian for expressing the figures. But yes, that's been done. Yes. Yes. So you can ask for 5 meters, and it should show the actual 5 meters and 16 pies, pulgadas. So yes, we've been doing that. Yep. Any other question before we finish? Yes?
Are you also going to translate the names of the functions, like seno?
Yes. So common functions like seno and those are translated for display, but of course we understand both the English and the Spanish form. Yes. Well, I think we are done. Thank you very much for your attention.